of art, culture, education, activism from a decolonial and critical perspective, and one that is centered around queer feminists, BIPOC, and migrant positions, and stories of resistance. And part of what is also important to acknowledge is to thank all the care workers and essential workers and migrant workers who make it possible for us to be here today. And it is through their collective labor, whether it is recognized or not, that we're able to survive, that we're able to function in society, especially in the context of a pandemic. I want to briefly introduce the panelists before we open it up to a set of questions, and then near the end have about 10 minutes or so for others to ask questions. So the first person is Natalie Aguilar Ba Bikoro. Natalie is a visual artist, emerging archaeology, sonic radio, writing textile sculptures, live art performances, film and archives for immersive installation. Her work analyzes processes of power and science fiction and historical archives, critically engaging in migrational struggles and colonial memory, focusing on queer, indigenous, and feminist biopolitics. She is a lecturer in visual cultures, curating, and philosophy at Trans Art Institute New York and Universitat de Puns in Berlin, and part of the collective Nyabingi Lab. She moderates the annual Berlinale Film Festival and currently has an artistic fellowship for the Goethe Institute in Bahia, Salvador, and research fellowships from the Somatic Charting Project of the Institute for Endomatic Research. Her work has been featured in several international exhibitions, including the Havana Biennial in Jakarta, as well as La Otra Biennial in Bogota. Saskia Kupchal is a curator, scholar, and editor with a focus on decolonial narratives. She completed her graduate studies as a Fulbright scholar at the New School for Social Research in Anthropology in New York City. From 2011 to 2018, she was a manager and curatorial member of Savvy Contemporary. She's also the co-editor of I Will Draw a Map of What I Never See, Endeavors in Rhythm Analysis. She, since 2019, she is a PhD candidate at RTG, minor Cosmopolitanisms, where she researches the colonial racist origins of the nudist movement. Timnit Zahra is a political scientist and one of the 3 founding members of Nyabingi Lab, Curatory Collective. She's lived in Berlin since 2015, where she implements projects at the intersections between political education, activism, and culture. She also works as project manager for the Heinrich Böll Stiftung and is a board member of the Kneza Foundation for Dialogue and Empowerment. Thank you again for joining us today for the DICE Conference and Festival. I wanted to open up by asking about the origins of the name of your collective. And can you elaborate how you came about and the history of the name Nyabingi as a collective and what significance it holds for the 3 of you? Anyone can start.
Yeah, so I will start. Sorry, it's a little bit awkward because you can't see the cues of other people, but thank you so much for the introductions, Edna, and for hosting this. Thank you also for DICE for organizing this. And yeah, I would like to join you also in thanking the health workers and all the essential workers. So I think the name, basically, I mean, we started working together for a while before we came up with this name, and it's kind of mirrors our approach to working on cultural topics, because we were looking into finding a name that is related to the history of German colonialism, but also resistance movements against the German colonial empire. And so we came across the story of Nyabingi, which was believed to be a spirit from a female warrior that periodically possessed female mediums in East Africa, particularly those that fought for the rights of the oppressed. And so she was like, there was this female resistance figure who was fighting against the German colonial troops, who was called Muhumusa, and she was believed to be possessed by the spirit of Nyabingi. So this is kind of where our research into this started, and we kind of were drawn to this name. And at the same time, as you mentioned earlier, it's also related to the Rastafarian movement, and it's also a drum rhythm. It's a gathering. It's the name of a gathering. So it kind of brings together all of the things that somehow matter in our practice as a collective. So this, bringing together the historical like stories that are kind of hidden or that people don't know too much about, relating that to the present, but also thinking through music, resistance, gatherings. So it's like, it's something that kind of brings all of these things together in a really nice way. So that's how it became our name.
Can I have a follow-up question? And this one's directed to Natalie, where your work has cut at the intersection of the ways in which Black women, and particularly women who are part of the African continent and suffered under the German colonial regime, and the ways in which they appear or maybe not appear in the archives. To what extent is that recovery of finding Black women in the archives so important for how we think about these collective acts of repair and resistance?
It's important because I think those stories are not isolated to their own. They really tell the story of global context, and also of the kind of transnational movement of migrants and workers that came to Germany and Europe. So actually the work that the Black women from the continent, but also the diaspora, what they did is that they kind of responded to the environment around them, the sort of social injustices that were happening, the inequalities, the struggles of workers and people of color. So it was not just resisting or fighting for one cause, but actually responding to the common cause of many people in different environments, the ones that were oppressed, also fostering for women's rights, but a lot of these efforts and these movements were often hijacked or were isolated or kept in the shadow, because history says that the narrator should be a man who tells a story, right? So the problem is now to recover these stories and narratives of these women is much more difficult, because they've been erased, most of them, and it's, I think, also it's led people to think that history only exists within the archives that you find and that are legitimate to the institution. So actually the work that I've been doing as a visual artist and as a curator is to take care, right? Because for me, curating and doing work as a visual artist is combined. It should not be two separate things, at least. And so you're taking care of those stories, you're taking care of people, you're taking care of certain practices. And of course, these practices are about healing, they're about resistance, they're about visibility, they're about making peace also. So a lot of these archives or these remnants or these ruins, I would say you find them in performativity, or often in ecologies or in sources that the institution don't legitimize. So that means you have to do the work also of thinking about speculative fiction and thinking of other ways to source these archives that are not just there for the given, or what we know as archives in bibliothèque or in exhibitions, but completely elsewhere. So that can mean in nature, that can mean in the descendants, also in performances, in films, in scripts, and these archives, they still remain, they haven't been erased. So that's the only, for me at least, is the only way to get closer to the intentions and also the empowering effect of the lives and the work of these women, and what does it mean in our condition and situation now in contemporary times, and why it's relevant for today.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to Temnet and really think about and ask about your kind of work as a political scientist and the ways in which your collective exercises practices of care, recovery, and acknowledgement through practices and strategies that are also attuned to the political dimensions we live in and what we might be striving for. Can you, Temnet, talk about how your collective empowers BIPOC communities in Germany, and by BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's really interesting if you really engage with the archives and work through them and work with them. What you find oftentimes, or at least what we have found, especially in the context of our last project, Radical Mutation on the Ruins of Rising Suns, is that most of these like artistic endeavors, most of these artistic productions have always been kind of connected to also like activist work, you know? So none of these things happened in a vacuum or just out of the imaginary of one singular person, but it's always been connected to different associations, organizations, initiatives that have been working to better the situation of Black people and BPOCs in Germany. And I think what was so interesting for us was that oftentimes, if you look into the history, especially of Black people in Germany, you oftentimes start at, I don't know, after the Second World War or in the 80s, you know, with the rise of like institutions or organizations like ESD or DEFRA. But there has been a history that even started way before that, you know, if you look at people like Louis Brody, for instance, who in the public or nowadays, if he is even mentioned, is oftentimes just seen as an actor, who he was, but he was also an activist. He was also very crucial in, or played a crucial role in different organizations at that time in the 20s and 30s. And I think that is what is so inspiring, I think, for us to kind of bridge that gap between activism or political education and art, which oftentimes is, you know, seen as two separate things. But I think the work of the Natalie Lab really, really lives in that space in between, right? It lives really in that space in between art, artistic practices and activism. So I think that has been really interesting for us. And I think looking forward, there's also very practical things that you need to do or that we want to do with our work. I think part of what we've done as part of our project that happened at HOW was to donate. So parts of the honorariums, for instance, were donated or will be donated to different organizations. And those are very practical things, but you rarely see those practices of taking care and supporting communities in the space of art. So that is the way that we do that.
Thank you so much. And I think your gesture towards German history and the presence of Black people in Germany is so important for all of us to think about, especially in the World War II context, where figures like Anton Wilhelm Amo, who is an 18th century Black scholar who was unfortunately stolen from West Africa, but also was here and educated in Germany, and complicates the narrative or idea that somehow Black people weren't here, even though we know that there's evidence of that. And that even people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who African-American scholar, sociologist who was here, Angela Davis studied here in Berlin, and the list goes on and on. To what extent is that recovery of history is something that you see changing or shifting in the German mainstream national consciousness, if at all? Any of you can answer that question if you want.
Maybe I can just start a bit. I don't know how yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's really changing and if that changes, yeah, a long-lasting one. I don't know, but I mean, of course, you see some gestures. I mean, even with the M-Straße, the renaming of that, you see certain gestures also from different institutions. I don't know. I don't know if that is a long-lasting thing, but I think what I find extremely fascinating, or what I think is extremely important in that type of work, is to really take care, because we're talking about people, you know, at the end of the day. And I think that is what is also where you have to be really self-reflective and also critical of your own approach in working with those stories, because even, I mean, with this theater piece, for instance, Sunrise and Morningland, we have been lucky enough to have one of the descendants, basically, of Louis Brody, who wrote that piece, with us here today in Berlin, and we were able to invite her to the program. So what I try to explain, or articulate, is to be very careful in the way in which you approach and work with these stories, because it's yes, they live in the archive. They are not seen by mainstream, I don't know, institutions or by the broader public. But if you try to, engage with these stories, you have to do your homework. You really have to take care and make sure that those people, to really actually do your research on who is still living here today, who's connected to that history, if that's the possibility, if you have the possibility to do that, but at least try to do that, And I think that was what we were so, or why I at least was really sensitive, because I'm like, okay, at the end of the day, that person's grandfather was living here, was doing this incredible work. I don't know how she feels about it, And I'm not as entitled to think that I can just take this up and make a program, And that sense of care, I think, is oftentimes missing. It's oftentimes missing when you work with, histories and the biographies, really, of people that have passed on. That's maybe my try to answer that question. But I think also what is really interesting, which really points to a structural problem that we have here in Germany, is that a lot of the research, especially the research on artistic practices prior to the Second World War by BIPOC people, is not being produced in Germany. Is not being produced by BPOC people, BPOCs. It's oftentimes in the UK or in the US, and that really, really speaks to the structural racism that is happening here in the German academia, that the fact that a lot of the people that have been doing that work are not in the academia. If you think about people like Katharina Oguntoye, for instance, who has written an incredible book and is really one of the grounds. I mean, that book really is one of the basis, was one of the basis also for our work. But the fact that she's not in academia, and so many other women and men that have been doing that work and not in academia, really speaks to the structural racism that is happening here. And so I think unless that is shifting, unless these stories are seen as valuable stories and also as stories of German history, I don't see how things really going to change.
Thank you, Timnit. I'll just add on what you say, because, and I'm glad, Anna, that you mentioned Anton Willem Amo, because in his context, actually, I mean, it's still part of very much of the African diaspora in Europe. No, it's isolation, right? So the problem is that this period was also a period of isolation. And when you're one of the very few people in your environment that basically you stand out, and then you always have to prove who you are. You always have to prove the kind of work or the genius that you are. So what it does is that it creates a whole history and a whole practice of people of color always surmounting themselves, or having to do too much and to be the best. And I think a lot of his work was reflecting on this isolation. He was reflecting on the context, but his context that he was talking about was also global. What was happening in terms of human rights? And I think the second part is also a problem of class, because, you know, those who were visible at the time, it was also because of class. Yeah, there was also the issue of privilege in terms of where you came from. If you were the descendants of a king from, you know, Cameroon, for example, or you were part of the descendant of a cultural family from the US. So therefore, when you travel to Europe, when you're in Germany, you're going to have more visibility because you have that privilege. And then the third thing is about integration. So as a Black diaspora, this is something that we have to learn when we leave our homes or our families, and then we have to integrate into another country. And this has always been the problem in Europe, notably of Germany, about this idea of integration, because actually it's not the migrant or the comer that should integrate, but more or less we have to think of society, how can Germany integrate to the rest of the world, and not how can this minority integrate. This is not, we're not talking about minority here, we're talking about, you know, global people moving around, and it's not new. It's just now we are in a state where it's very much about profit and tokenization. And we also see that in the way that institutions, especially in the arts and culture, they do this. And this is what Timnit is talking about taking care, because at the end of the day, you know, you're finding information that you don't know, or you're getting closer to more intimate stories of people that are not here anymore, but maybe their descendants are. And it's likely, especially in Germany, that their descendants are still here, but don't know much about their grandparents or their great-grandparents who've done a lot of work within the cultural sphere here or as activists. And, you know, you can't just tokenize on these stories. You cannot, because at the end of the day, it's also who is allowed to speak of them, who is allowed to own them. If the state has always owned the stories of Black people and then purposely erased them, you know, it's already telling you who profits from it and who will decide who holds the space. And I think, you know, when you look between 1910 to today, there have been over, I was trying to look for organizations and initiatives within arts and activism, and there's about 376. Can you imagine? 376 organizations within the arts and culture working as in activism also by people of color. And these stories are very little known, because it depends also who has access to those stories, who reads them, who is able to tell those stories also. Because actually, you know, I think for me, what I learned is that people are not telling their stories here. You know, they're not talking about what happened, you know, in the 1980s, or they're not talking about this case in 1946 or blah, blah. We are really sometimes we find ourselves handicapped because we are holding on to mainstream stories. So, you know, everybody's much more, for example, has much more accessibility and is more comfortable with the work of Audre Lorde, but a lot of it still people don't know, and it's her most important. And it was about the engagement that she had with the community. It was about intimate stories. So for me, it's also a warning, because then if we had all these organizations, 376 organizations since 1910, doing all this work before us, we were never the first, and asking the same questions, having the same issues, Black women having the same issues. They felt that they were tokenized, that the stories were not being heard, because organizations, institutions, including Black men, were saying that no, we don't want you to be at the forefront. This is our story. We say it. And so now we come to the point where in 2020 we have the, you know, very similar voices and experiences. So what it tells you that, you know, we have to be very careful about, you know, the repetition of history, and how can we learn from it? why we still deem to go through this repetition, and then our job now, our passion is that how we can do this differently, so that basically we don't forget, and then we allow the confidence that people can tell their own stories in a way that is integral to them and that is protective, so they don't feel tokenized or they don't feel profited by other people who then claim, this is a great story, I'm going to profit from it for using, Black bodies. And this is also something that we're very aware about, that we don't agree. So yeah, this, and I was just thinking about, other women like Florence Price, who was also part of the work that the string orchestra performed, some of her pieces. These are exactly the same question that she was asking. And also the fact that the visibility of people of color it's not because they were less, it's because they didn't have the same vocabulary. They insisted that I do not want to be remembered in history as the Black artist or as the Black singer or as the Black actor. I want to be remembered as an actor, punct. So there's also, and now we have a different formation because it's a different time with a different type of urgency and a different type of vocabulary that we use to inform each other, but also to confront us, say, hey, you are not isolated, you are not alone. So it's a way to anchor, but and that's how, some things in history get lost, because also a different position and different vocabulary also.
I think I would add, thank you, Natalie and Timnit. I would like to add to that, to come back to your question, Edna, if something is changing. I think one of the scary things about our research, especially for this, the program Radical Mutation at HAU, Hebel am Ufer, which was drawing inspiration, amongst others, from Sunrise in Morningland, the first Black theater revue that was performed in Germany, was how easily even the progress that happens gets erased, right? Because even us, working with these stories, the three of us in different realms for many years, didn't know about this theater piece, and were really surprised that that something like that happened in 1930. And and just also we took it as a warning sign to say, like, how long, I mean, it took like almost 90 years for someone to take it up again, after it happened, because it was so silenced. Of course, the National Socialists came to power 3 years after it was performed. The theater piece itself is lost. The script itself is lost. So nobody really remembered it. And then the only reason why we even know about it is because of the research of people like Robbie Aitken, who went into US and UK archives and found, like, basically articles that were published in newspapers back then about this piece. But there's only 1 or 2 articles left in German, in German archives about this. And this was performed throughout the whole year of 1930. And even the US newspapers at the time reported about this. So, but here, you can't find it anywhere. So this is also something that, why I guess it's we should be careful about saying, or like thinking about whether or not things change, because as Timnit already said, we don't know if it's a lasting. For sure, there's more attention right now on the work of people like even Natasha Kelly or Euto, who've been doing this work, also this research, or even Katharina Oguntuye, for many, many years, researching these stories for many years. But at the same time, as we saw with the research on the things that happened in Weimar Republic, those things are also very easily reverted or back.
Thank you so much for all these insights. And what you're pointing to is, of course, there are barriers that can exist with the polarizations that exist in our societies, the alienation that is strong felt when people might be coming from different ethnic backgrounds, even when they're just labeled Black. So someone could be coming from an upper class background in Cameroon, as you mentioned, or a person might be coming from Afro-Brazilian background or Afro-American, etc. And sometimes the hierarchies that exist within the countries that they come from can be reproduced, and when they come to to Germany. At the same time, what this the question is, the ways in which the Black diaspora and its multi-ethnic capacity also can be a source of power, love, and care. When I think about my time here in Berlin, one thing I discovered was the Jollof wars between Ghanaians and Nigerians, whereby people compete allegedly about who makes the best jollof rice. And it opens up space and possibilities for love and care, and reminds me of Toni Morrison, in particular, her book Beloved, where in that text, which is about the African-American experience after the Civil War, after they were emancipated from slavery, she says, right, love is or it isn't, thin love isn't love at all. And what it opens up is how, on the one hand, the traumas that we experience might sometimes cause us not to feel that love, but yet in the act of telling a story, the act of rewriting histories to center Black experiences, which is what Toni Morrison did, it opened the space for her to articulate ideas and conceptions of motherly love, sibling love, etc. To what extent does love in the work that you do get exercised, carried out? To what extent is that part of the praxis of liberation that you put forth in your artistic practices as a collective?
Who wants to start? Okay, let me try to answer that. Goodness, this is a loaded question. I think for me, really love, or the way that it shows up in our work, I think is really taking care in the sense of, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like at the end of the day, you work with people, you know, and this is something that oftentimes get lost in even in collective work, in working especially with institutions. And if I see someone is hurting, or if I see someone is stressed out, if I see that my friend is, you know, is not doing well, I'm not going to push. I'm going to ask how someone is feeling, you know. And if that means that you miss a deadline, if that means that you come, you know, a bit late to, I don't know, to a meeting or whatever, then that's what it is. So I think really what is incredibly important is really what are your principles? And I think this is what I actually really value with the work that the three of us are doing, or the way that we work, is that we are very transparent, but there's also trust. And I think that is incredibly important to have, and something that you don't have oftentimes. And so that sense of transparency and trust is, I mean, I would have never imagined doing this program that we have done without without Saskia and without Natalie. And I know for a fact it wouldn't have been as great as it was if it wasn't for the three of us coming together the way that we did with our individual background. So it's really in the little things, you know. I think this concept of love or self-love in general, you know, oftentimes it can just stay in this theoretical space, but it's really how you show up every day, you know, how you take care of one another, if you eat together, if you laugh together, if you listen to music together, like all of these things really matter. And that really changes the way that you approach your work. And it also changes the way that you approach artists, because even in that curatorial, you know, work, it's at the end of the day, just as Natalie has said earlier, it's really about taking care, you know. It's like, it's not about, and Natalie is always saying this, not like a catalog and you're looking through to find something that is that fits your concept. Is really about engaging with the artist as an individual, as a person, you know, and not as someone that is, you know, contributing to your program and makes it, you know, better or whatever. So yeah, that would be my way to answer it. And I think also time plays a big role, or patience, you know. I think everyone changed. I mean, at least I can say that this year has been a very hectic one and a very challenging one, I think, for all of us. But also have that patience with yourself, you know, to learn from past mistakes, you know, to learn from experiences, and be open to change, you know, and acknowledge your shortcomings. And yeah, and that is, I think, really what is really important in any type of collaborative work. But which is unfortunately not often, oftentimes it's not the case. I think that is what that's the challenge, basically, you know.
I'll second to that, Timnit. Yeah, I mean, Timmy was talking about, I always say this, I really don't like this kind of curating where it's like it's like a supermarket and you just choose. This is not curating. Like, you know, often I think the practice of booking also, I'm not, you know, because I think at least working the three of us and doing this program, Radical Mutation, is that when I think about love, I think about commitment. And I feel also that it's about safety. So I make sure that, you know, when an artist is with us, when a guest is with us, you take care of them like you're their family member. You commit, you know, we exchange conversations, we eat together. Eating is the most important. Every evening we dine together and we talk, you know. You need a massage, okay, let's give you a massage, you know, we accompany you every step of the way. So that is kind of, you know, we are interested in building, you know, real relationships, you know, even if they are transglobal, you know, it's, I think that, you know, feeling touched by people's spirits is really important. And this is something that is really, I find throughout decades and centuries in practice of resistance is absolutely enormous to do. But it's also, for me, it's about respecting everybody's practices, respecting everybody's rhythms. Also, like the longevity, commitment, and also, you know, like really fighting for, you know, for your guest, you know. So if you really want them to be part of your narrative, the story that you want to do, and you also know that, you know, you get to know the person's work. So it's not like, you know, you already maybe, you know, you already seen the work before in a different context, or you've been following their work for several years and it has an effect on you personally. I think always a work of art, in what form it is, it has to connect with you on a deeper level. It's not just about selecting because it fits the trend or it fits the, you know, the decolonial vocabulary. This is not what, you know, this is not what our focus was really. Our focus was about understanding the enormous amount of level of fighting and commitment that was already going on in the city. People that we knew, people that we got to know, and take care of this work for at least those moments in this program, and say that, hey, we need to have a conversation together. You need to see what it is to fight. You need to understand what it is to take care. Fight is about love. Resistance is about love. And so I think for me anyway, was really acknowledging these fights and this commitment. And I think also, you know, like for us, it was really, really touching and really hard to see actually that a lot of those people individually really fight for their lives in order to do what they're doing, you know, and they don't give up, they still continue. So, you know, and that you have to pay respect in the best way possible. So, you know, so for me, it is about, you know, taking care of relationships, new and old ones, and then also just expanding and elastifying on these works and all of these contexts, so they go in different directions. So it opens up different possibilities for all these individuals to do things differently, to think differently, to bring different collaborations and different people together. This is love, you know. So, and I think, you know, for me, working with Timnit and Saskia, for sure, it has been about trust, but also about an understanding to each other. We don't just work together on a program. We really support each other every step of the way, as moms, as friends, and without that, there's no room for resistance.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie and Timnit. I would expand that, like taking care. I mean, the aspect of taking care of artists in this case, because we don't have our own space. We're a collective who we work with different spaces, and many of those spaces are not the most loving and caring ones. So in this case, for example, it means to make sure that the anti-discrimination clause will be part of not just our contracts, but also the contracts of the artists. And this is something that we will have to, because we work with institutions, this is something that also on a very practical level needs to be part of our work. And we're still in the process of kind of figuring out what all of these kind of components are that make working in a certain space with us, but also with the space that's hosting us, a space that is safe and and loving, if you want to put it like that. And then also I would extend that also to the audience, because we were also thinking about what does it mean to do a program like Radical Mutation, for example, in a space like the Hebel Theater, like one of the most historical, oldest theater spaces in Berlin, and theater being one of the most exclusive, racist, classist spaces you can be in. So what does it mean to do this program there? How do we actually also rethink who will be in the audience, who we're addressing, whose needs we're also addressing this, and who are we speaking to? Do we explain things in a way that everybody gets it, or do we, for example, imagine for a program like Radical Mutation a BIPOC audience as the one that we're addressing? So then a lot of things change when you about like the way you write the concept, who you invite, how the program runs, when you kind of also take care of the audience in a different way, also include that in your considerations and extend your care to them to some extent.
Thank you so much for all of these wonderful responses and reflections on love and care and why it's so essential within your artistic practice, as well as how you're received by your audiences. In their curatorial project, Radical Mutations on the Ruins of Rising Sun, you also collaborated with We Are Born Free Empowerment Radio, which included migrants by the names of Mora Yaf, Bino Bayansini, Bachakuleka, and Mohammed Lamin Jadama. And together you're able to bring over 70 creative people, BIPOC people mostly, who live here in Berlin, and to really think about recovery, healing, and what does it mean to create art in this moment during a pandemic. I can imagine on a practical level, it was also important for people whose income had been minimized during this period, and like you indicated, having an anti-discrimination clause and policies put into place to support and care for and allow people to come together, breathe. And one particular quote, because I also attended, that Bino said as part of We Are Born Free Radio, he said, "Never undermine the power of your voice," and it struck with me because of in this moment where people might be feeling alienated, when people are isolated in their homes, etc. Having a voice, coming together can be quite difficult. So before we open up to the audience, I wanted to just ask, to what extent do you think that this programming was able to uplift the creative BIPOC voice here in Berlin?
I think, it was definitely challenging to come up with a program like that during a pandemic, for sure. But I think what was also very challenging was just the time that we had to prepare. So basically, it was something like 2 months from the initial first call until the opening. And that is extremely ambitious. And as you have said yourself, Edna, it's been about more than 70 artists. And most of them really were, I think, except for 6, it was all BIPOCs that were part of the program, which is unheard of, and which I haven't seen so far in Berlin happening. And that on top of that, in an institution like the HAU. So that was, we didn't expect for that turnout, to be honest. I think we were also not sure how different artists would respond to our invitation because of the pandemic and the fact that so many of us are really exhausted and at their limits, really. But I think for a lot of them, it was also nice, to be back in a space, to perform in front of an audience. And especially during the evenings where we had like musicians on stage, those were the ones that we had a lot of, not delays, but basically we had to stick to 90 minutes per evening. But on those evenings, we were always like 2 hours or even more than that, to be honest, because people were just so happy to listen to live music. And I think that was really uplifting. And I think just the fact that we were able to invite so many different people, it was from so many different practices that haven't been together in that constellation before. And what I really, really appreciated more, actually not more, but as much as the program on stage were really the conversations before and after that were happening, and I think that in itself was very empowering, and for a lot of people really like this kind of relief, after the summer and everything going on. It was, you could really see, or that was the response that we got from a lot of the participants, that it was a very welcomed, relief and a moment to to come together and and celebrate, really celebrate and exchange and connect. And I think also what was really important as part of the concept also was that question that Saskia raised before: who are we addressing? Who's the audience that we have in mind? And people could tell, that it's in a program, a program really that is that has BIPOCs in mind as their audience. And this is how we, decided to invite the participants that we invited. And I think it was also that was the beauty of being able to see the entire program, is just the diversity of it. You have people like the string orchestra, you have people like Tema Warbeng, you had Maya, like who's an actress and did a really moving monologue. So it's been so many different formats. You had music with the swag. It was really, that was really the beauty, because you could really see how diverse artistic practice, artistic practices from Black people here in Berlin look like, and the variety of them.
And what was really great also was just that the artists made such a huge work to actually adapt the work, especially for this program. So we wanted to be able to give some liberty to the artists in terms of the work that they wanted to present, but also think about fragmentation, because, I think often with theater space and work, we always have certain expectation. It is what Saskia said, it is about class and also domination of narratives. And we wanted something also where it was about, archival ruinations and fragments of something that doesn't need to have a beginning, middle, and end, but kind of have a spectrum of different things and different experiences. And then what happened is that all these artists also it was really, really beautiful because they got to know each other. You know, they didn't know each other because they were also isolated from each other. So it gave them an opportunity to understand, okay, like, you know, who's also in this city and doing this work, and how is it going to touch them? How is it going to push their own work, you know? And then when, I mean, as Timnit said, you know, our biggest limitation was time. And to go through, you know, thinking about the concept and thinking, you know, going through research and also finding out that, you know, because of the historical context at the time, that a lot of, you know, when we wanted to put to the forward, you know, which narratives of BIPOC people in theater remain, it's like very few, although they were there, but it's you know, it's all purposely gone. And so, yeah, and basically Sunrise in Morningland was one of the very few pieces of work that remained, but that was also talked about. And that's the irony, is that all of these archives, these stories, were researched and written by, you know, English scholars. You know, nobody from Germany scholar is doing that research. So, and it also pays attention to, you know, the state of the, you know, the structure within academia, university, and again, like, who's saying the stories, and what kind of stories do researchers here want to enforce? Is it again a kind of, you know, like exoticization and anthropology that cannot work, you know, anymore? And so, you know, the work of Robbie Aiken and also even Natasha helped us a lot with figuring out these fragments of history and see where our focus was. And the thing is, what we did is that instead of making an approach about, we didn't want to make topics or display or do something about. We wanted also that this program was reflecting basically on our own experiences as creatives in the city. No, so this is the approach that I think I don't see it so much with curators, but it has to be a personal approach also. It has to be your story, because at the end of the day, guess what? We are the descendants. We are also the descendants. We are carrying all these stories and all these narratives and archives with us. And therefore, hey, you know, yes, this is our voice. We do have our stories to say, and that's why we build it in chapters. And these chapters reflected on each of our own narrations, but also together what we went through as a group. You know, so we started with like the troubles, if nobody knows the troubles we've seen, to then ending with, you know, recovery. So, and that was, you know, addressing these things. We were addressing this directly also to the descendants. We were also, you know, pushing forward to remind about this practice, you know. It was about also white fragility, you know. I think it was really interesting to see the dualities also that was happening, you know, within the people who were presenting their works and people who were listening and seeing. So yeah, I think for me I think it was not just about like finding archives. This is only a first step. It's not good enough if you just, oh, you're finding archives, it's exciting. This is not curating. If you find this exciting and then you want to put in a topic, then you're perpetuating the same system of violence again. The idea is, the practice is of love is how to transform that. And who is going to do that job? Not everybody can do it. And we know exactly who can do this transformation of this history and who does it belong to.
I just want to add one last thing. I think the pandemic in some way also created a situation that we never had as curators before, which is you can only work with people who are in your city, right? So everybody in this program, with the exception of one person, is based in Berlin, lives in Berlin. And I think often, especially bigger institutions tend to rather invite, for example, BIPOC, non-BIPOC speakers from the US or the continent, even, to kind of like, who also speak about, you know, racism, for example, in their contexts like racism in the US, for example, but there's not much attention on the people who are doing this work here, or not enough attention on the people who have been doing this work here for a really long time. So it's always easier to invite people from elsewhere. So now it's a pandemic, nobody can travel, so you can't actually do that. So this actually created an interesting, and we wanted to also use this opportunity to create the space for just people who do this work in Berlin. And we also put then ourselves the challenge to also just work with stories that happened in Berlin, you know, that of course always have a relationship to the Harlem Renaissance, for example, or the continent. That there's always, of course, Berlin historically has been a place where all these stories interlink, and that's important too, but it's not always considered the center of these stories. So we made an effort to kind of like also only use titles and so on and so forth, stories that really relate to Berlin in one way or the other, and work with people from Berlin. And this is also something that I think maybe wouldn't have happened in this form if it wasn't for this pandemic and its restrictions, but it opened up a really interesting space for us to really make Berlin the center of this, because Berlin is the place where we work. Berlin is the place that has all of these histories that still shape, you know, institutions, cultural spaces, and so on and so forth. And that's the institutions that we work in. So it's also really important to kind of do this work where, you know, in the place where we're actually working with the people who've been here doing this.
So we have 1 minute left, and I realize I didn't make time for the people to ask questions. But before we end, I just want to thank you so much for your contributions. And like you said, all of you, we are here in Berlin and we live here in Germany, and it is the site in which the Berlin African partition happened without any consultation from Africans. And instead of reproducing the erasure that has happened in the past, y'all are creating new set of archives, new set of relationships. And as your work has been showing, you're allowing the space for us to have the collective power to reshape the future. And I really appreciate the radical change that you're enacting in the here and now. So thank you again. If you have any last words, you can share them right now before we depart.
Just thank you to Dice and you, Edna. It's been a pleasure, I think, for all of us to have this conversation, and I think we're all looking forward to maybe see each other soon again in real life. We'll see. But thank you so much, Edna.
Yeah, thank you, Edna, and also for the invitation for Dice for us to make this conversation possible with you all.
Yeah, thank you also from my side.
Thank you. Okay, I think with that, we just leave. I'm not sure how this works, but I hope that people can follow your collective, Mia Bingi, and also go online to find some of the recordings from the Radical Mutations on the HAL website, and We Are Born Free Empowerment Radio. They also have regular programming, and there's so many organizations, particularly BIPOC, migrant-led refugee organizations that you had listed that people can support, like International Women's Space, IOTO, ESD. Together we can hopefully get through this moment of isolation, and we can be stronger together. Okay. So I guess we just leave the room, but bye.